Hello, everyone. This is Tom O'Connor of the Gulf Coast Legal Technology Center in New Orleans. And I'm back for what will be our final session in this series on Office 365 and eDiscovery. As always, I'm joined by Rocky Messing from the Microsoft Legal Department. What's your exact title again, Rocky? I've said it enough times, but I forget it. I'm sorry.
I'm a senior program manager.
Senior program.
My official title for whatever titles mean. Yeah.
Which means you're the guy they come to when they need questions answered about this, right?
Yeah, basically. It means that I lead the eDiscovery team internally here at Microsoft, working on our litigations and corporate external affairs team.
Right. You know, I've never asked, how big is that team?
So we actually have a pretty small team dealing with our litigation eDiscovery. The total team is 5 people, of which only 3 are basically tasked. Their main jobs are handling casework. So it's a pretty lean team, a very good team, a team that's been together for a while. But using these tools and other tools that we integrate into our process, we're able to get all of the work done for a corporation the size of Microsoft. Now, there is a separate investigations team,
okay.
And that's a little bit bigger because they need people all around the world dealing with specific issues around investigations and going to actually talk to people and desktop collection, stuff like that. But even that team's not huge, considering the size of Microsoft.
Well, and the point I wanted to make is one you just stated, which is you're able to leverage tools like this to make small litigation teams extremely efficient.
Exactly.
That's the point of the technology. So great. So I thought what we do today, Rocky, is just as sort of a wrap up, if you will, a synopsis, is sort of look at something that people are familiar with. Each one of the sessions we've done, of course, has drilled down into a specific function inside of Office 365. And at the very beginning, we talked about the EDRM, the Electronic Discovery Reference Model, which has become sort of the standard flow chart, if you will, for analyzing eDiscovery workflow. And maybe just quickly go over each one of those so you can synopsize or summarize, if you will. I'm not sure synopsize is even a word. But we're lawyers, so we can make words. It's okay.
You can make things up, right?
Talk about the EDRM as a way for people to once again use this as a framework for how the Office 365 tool set is relevant within this workflow. So if that's agreeable to you, I'll just jump us through each one of these, and you can give a quick summary or overview of the Office 365 tool that applies.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a good idea. And luckily we have in the documentation, we actually have a alignment with the EDRM piece of the documentation. So we'll utilize that for the image. But let's walk through them.
So, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because as I was saying to you before we went live here, I refer to this particular web page when I have questions of this nature. I presume that everybody who's watching can see that URL that's up there at the top, and they can get to this. This is a great resource for if you want to dive into one of the specific EDRM functions and see how Office 365's eDiscovery features apply to it. This is a great resource. So I highly recommend this source for just further information beyond what we're gonna cover right now. So let's jump into, of course, the first one on the far left, information management, where it all begins.
Yeah. So I think this is probably the one area that is the newest in terms of development in Office 365, which is the pieces around the records management, labels, making sure that you're deleting the right data, making sure that you're keeping the right data, all of those pieces that we walk through in terms of retention, preservation, and proper records management and labeling. So those are all the things that hit into that information management piece.
Great. Next up, of course, is identification. If we think of information management as whatever the framework is in the organization to manage, to structure, to index, to catalog all of your information. How do we identify what it is we're looking for in our particular matter?
Yeah, so I think the first piece of that just comes down to good old-fashioned, lawyering, which is knowing the players and obviously knowing who the custodians are and building out that network of who needs to be talked to and whose data needs to be looked at. But we took a look in the custodian management pieces, where the Office 365 tools are actually able to help you there, that when you identify a custodian, it'll actually identify their various different sources of data. So it'll pull up their email exchange mailbox, it'll pull up their OneDrive, as well as give you a list of their team, SharePoints, things like that they have access to help you identify what are the right places that you're going to need to deal with when it comes to this specific eDiscovery process for this case.
Great. I can't tell you how happy I am to hear you use the phrase good old-fashioned lawyering. We get so wound up in the technology these days, and with all the talk of AI, we're coming up on ILTACon, the annual user conference for the ILTA group of IT and tech people at law firms. And AI is just dominating the conversation, as is smart searching, predictive coding, continuous active learning. It's good to hear somebody who's in the trenches talking about the basis of all this is good old-fashioned lawyering, because I think that's getting lost in the shuffle or in the discussion an awful lot, and we're spending a whole lot of time talking about technology and not about the technologist. So
it's exactly, and not necessarily even the technologist. It can be even someone who doesn't really understand or doesn't need to understand the technology. You still need that basis of the intelligence and the person who actually understands what the goals are and what we're trying to truly accomplish here. And that's
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and that's where the good old-fashioned lawyering, having a good, smart attorney who understands what we're actually trying to do, and then can make use of the tools as appropriate. So
I wrote a blog post, I don't know, a year or so ago, where I said when AI started first looming into everyone's rear view mirror, and I said, AI, before we talk about artificial intelligence, we should talk about attorney intelligence. And that should be the basis for these discussions, and make sure that the attorneys understand what this process is and why we're doing it. Because really, and I'm sure you know this, when someone has to explain to the judge, when there's a question about what the process was that was used, that someone is going to be one of the attorneys. The judge is not going to call your computer system to the stand and ask it to explain itself. The attorneys are going to have to understand this workflow that we're looking at in each one of these steps. So I think it's just a really good point, one we should not lose track of. Yeah. So we've identified the documents. How do we preserve them?
So preservation, there's obviously the preservation pieces that took place or can take place in the earlier stages in information management. around the proactive. But from a eDiscovery perspective, what preservation is referring to here is that reactive, when I've got either a case has started or I know that a case is imminent. And for that, we have the various different tools for the legal holds, where you're able to preserve the data in place, making sure that the data that is being deleted or being edited, that the original copies are always going to be stored in the back end of the Office 365 system for that individual user, and that it will always be available, so that way when it comes time, we're going to be able to do the next steps and be able to handle the actual searching, processing, et cetera, because it doesn't help to do any of those unless the data is actually preserved. So all of those preservation stages of the legal hold, and making sure that that hold is properly put in place, and having the right statistics around it, and knowing what data has been put on hold, all of those things are essential within the system. It's really the backbone, because without it, none of the rest matters.
Right. And that brings us obviously into the collection. You preserved everything, but how do you take out the ones you want to use, the documents you want to use for the particular task or task that you're going to work on immediately? Preserving gets them sitting there in place, but we want to collect them, or I often use the phrase gather. We want to gather them, only because then we can say that it's a gathering and we're all really superhuman characters who wield massive swords. And I, of course, then display a picture of Sean Connery from the movie, who portrays me, of course. I'm sorry, I digress. How do we collect, Rachi, in Office 365?
So this is one of those pieces where probably the EDRM model, the actual model, probably is going to need to get updated as things are more and more cloud-based. Because a lot of the true collection, as it was referred to here, isn't really collecting. It used to be that we'd collect the data and put it somewhere, gather it together and put it on drive somewhere. Now, because of the in-place model, you're able to actually, all the data is already collected. It's already gathered together. Now it's really a matter of going through, and I'm going to jump ahead into the processing stage also, because, the data is generally there. It's generally ready. You're able to search it. You're able to do whatever you need to do. You might have to do some error handling around some of the data that we can talk about in processing, but it's all ready to filter, to collect, to figure out what is it within there that I actually need to deal with. So
and to your point, I think this is one of the strengths of Office 365. As you said, in the earlier days of eDiscovery and the earlier days of fleshing out this model, we were looking at very distinct steps in the collection, being going to different places and getting the data. And now, of course, and I don't think it's necessarily exclusively, I should say, just the cloud. Large corporations, even if they have their own servers, still have all the data in one place or places in a LAN or a WAN, if you will. So that's a little bit different, and the processing also used to be very much a separate piece of software. The data had to be first identified, second preserved, then collected, then processed by moving this data around. Of course, in Office 365, we don't have to do that. It's two observations. One, Don Swanson, who's a consultant who you know well, who works with Microsoft in this arena, he and I did a survey last year to see where people were in their thinking about Office 365. And one of the things that struck me about our results was that the vast majority of respondents didn't think that Office 365 did processing, because they viewed it as a separate stage using a separate tool. And one of the beauties, of course, of you're going to discuss that individually in a second, is that you don't have to do that anymore. I do think the distinction on collection that still exists and is problematic, of course, for people now is mobile devices, cell phones, anything in the wide, wonderful world of Alexa devices that may be scattered throughout the office, but cell phones primarily, where you still do have to go and perform some sort of a often painful forensics collection. But that's a discussion for another time. I'd like to move to processing and have you talk about it, because this to me is one of the beauties of Office 365, that we're not taking that data and extracting it and having to move it someplace. So tell us how you handle that processing step.
Yeah, so again, the processing in general, the main function of processing is to get the data in a state where it's ready to be searched. So you're building an index behind it, and where you're going ahead and resolving any of the errors. So data that couldn't be indexed to actually figure out what needs to be done with it. So a lot of those pieces now are just inherently within the system. All the data is indexed by default. There's going to be some data that you're not able to index. It's not going to be searchable, I should say. And that's the data that is going to be able to be segregated through the error remediation process in order to be able to handle that offline. So it doesn't have, some of the processing tools have built-in password crackers and things like that. You're still going to have to use some other method of handling and resolving the errors. But the percentage of data that needs to go through that is so small that usually that's not a big deal. That's not a problem, even in large environments. I think that the key point here is that fact that the data is just ready to be searched. It's ready to be filtered. You can use all the metadata filters. All of those different things are just there in place in the system, ready to go.
Right. And I can't overemphasize how not only important that is, how much more effective that is in terms of not just the handling of the data, but speed and getting the processing resolved. Go ahead.
I get it from three things, Tom. I mean, it's that efficiency of the speed. It's the cost, because you're not having to pay per gig or per whatever in order to process that data. And almost as important is the security, because I'm no longer having to move that data to a different environment where now I'm duplicating that data. I've got more than one copy sitting out somewhere, sometimes even within my environment. Sometimes I have to send it out to a vendor. But the less data that I'm moving around and that I'm duplicating, the more secure, the less risk I'm taking from a corporate security perspective around making sure that data is managed properly.
Right. So the next two blocks are also two that now tend to go together sometimes, depending upon how you're working, and that is analytics and review, analysis and review. A lot of analytics can be done as part of the processing stage now, and I know that you've mentioned several times that you don't consider Office 365 eDiscovery to be a review tool in the sense of a relativity or other such tools. So why don't you talk to me about that? Explain to people what you're doing in these two areas.
Yep. So the analysis tools are really about organizing the data in ways to make it more efficient for the reviewer to review. So that's where all of the different email threading, near duplication, thematic analysis, all of those different pieces are going to come in. And then you also have the predictive coding, which ties into both analysis and review to help you to, again, filter that data, prioritize that data. Again, it's all about how do I properly organize the data to make it efficient for the attorneys to look at. And the review piece, while I think, Tom, the point that you were alluding to, that I say that it's not a review tool. So, the goal of the Office 365 review modules is really for those small, medium cases where I've just got a couple of documents, maybe a couple thousand items that I need to look at. Sure, one attorney going through it quickly, it's going to work beautifully. But when I've got large teams of attorneys where I need to have them really go through and spend the time in the documents in a very organized way, batches, security around those batches,
Right.
all kinds of reporting around the review, on all of those different types of things, that's where, yes, I'm going to use a third-party review tool in order to accomplish that. And I'm going to move the data out of Office 365 in order to accomplish that type of review. But if it's just I need to go through some stuff, tag it quickly as being responsive or not responsive, or privilege or not privilege, that's where that review can absolutely take place. Or if I'm doing the review from I've got 100,000 items, I've got 1 million items, whatever it is, and I want to do some, review sampling type of review to help me figure out how to cull and how to further filter down the data. Again, that's where those tools will be very useful.
Excellent. And that then brings us rather automatically, you mentioned about exporting out to something else. Well, what are the production features?
So from a true production perspective, it really depends on what production you're trying to do. You can export out data in native format, which, Tom, I know you've in the past, you've got some opinions around native exports and production, but I can export the data out in native format with the text files, with the load file with all the metadata and all the analytics information, as well as PDF versions of any redacted files. So all of those things I'm able to do. It does not do Bates labeling or Bates numbering or electronic numbering for electronic native files or anything like that. But it does give you that ability to export out the native files. So it really depends on what your production needs are, whether or not you're going to be able to just do it. A lot of our very small employment type matters where we just need to get out a small, we'll end up with 30 to 50 documents in the end. We'll use this. Right. It's something that's a larger production. It's not going to go through this. It's going to go through another, eDiscovery production tool in order to handle it. But in terms of the exports and being able to have everything available to you that you could need in terms of either exporting to a third-party review tool or exporting to a third-party, production system, or being able to actually do a native export, native production, and having certain metadata available. You might have to edit the metadata file afterwards to remove analytics or remove anything that you might not want to turn over in that, but it is available to do some of those pieces. So again, I'd say this is, and presentation we won't even really go to because there are no presentation tools native within the eDiscovery tools. Obviously, there's other things around PowerPoint and other production tools that I can use, like Sway, for creating presentations. But from a pure eDiscovery standpoint, that export stage is where the eDiscovery tools will end within Office 365.
I guess I'm not asked you this before, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but since we're in the Office 365 environment, easily move whatever your documents are into PowerPoint if you want to?
Well, so obviously we saw in the export stage that I am able to export it out to an Azure container. Yes. And from that Azure container, I can manage that data. It's sitting out there as a basically look at it as file storage. So I can do pretty much anything that I'd want to do with it from that container. to go ahead and then move it into PowerPoint or anything like that. But there's no direct, there's nothing built from a pure eDiscovery perspective today to say, okay, I'm taking these 20 items that I've found that I've flagged as exhibits, and I want to move them into PowerPoint or into some other type of presentation tool automatically. So you don't have that piece within Office 365 eDiscovery.
Understood. Great. Thanks. Well, that's great. There were a couple of questions that came up throughout the course of our series, and we wanted to address several of them at least quickly now without eating up too much time. One was just defensibility. We several times, and it's always a surprise to me that people are asking about the defensibility of the tool. What's going to happen? My attorney wants to know, how am I going to defend what we did here? I think, at least in the federal courts and the decisions I've seen, the courts tend to look at the process, not the tool per se. And so you have to remember, we've got a series of tools here, and I think it's robust because it's a platform tool. It's a platform in a tool. It's a breath mint, and it's but the key that I always see come up, and has been a phrase that has been used in court decisions, is, do you have a repeatable, defensible process? Are you employing something that was not cobbled together just for the particular case that you're working on, but tends to be a process or a workflow that is used by your organization, or if in the case of a law firm, your client's organization, so that you can defend that repeatable, defensible process? And I think that that's the way to analyze this. You use the tools as you just explained, Rachi. They can be done in a number of different ways within the EDRM framework, depending on what you have. And you advise your client or your company, if for instance, your case, you're the internal legal department. This is how we're going to do it, and this will be the process that's used every time. That's what courts tend to look at.
That, and I would add one other piece to that, which is documentation.
Oh, yes. Excellent point. Excellent point. And part of the issue here is to make all of that readable. I'm sure you face this yourself in dealing with people. Lawyers tend to have their own lexicon. Technologists tend to have their own lexicon, and you want to make sure that everybody's speaking the same language, if you will, and it's something that can be conveyed easily to a court should the question come up. As Judge Peck, former Judge Peck in New York, used to like to say, let's have bring your geek to court day so they can explain this all to me. When I'm doing CLEs, one of the phrases I like to use is I flash a picture of Denzel Washington from the movie Philadelphia, and the phrase that he used over and over again as a trial lawyer: explain this to me like I'm a 6-year-old. So I think it's important to remember that we don't get overly technical, both in our explanations and our documentations. And I think that Office 365 lends itself to that ease of explanation.
Agreed, 100%.
Questions that you saw come up? Did you have any that were?
There were a couple questions specific to how to deal with teams. Both from the identifying teams, which I think we talked about a little bit, as well as a question that I'll actually talk in a minute about from a roadmap perspective that's in the middle of rolling out right now. Okay. That was teams related. But yeah, please, again, questions are welcome to both Tom and myself, and we'll be happy to address them as we keep going.
One I think that you touched upon just a minute ago was how will this all apply to small cases, small firms? Obviously, Microsoft is interested in corporate clients and the setting that you described just within your own organization, a legal team that supports a large corporation. But all of these features are I think, useful in a subject that's near and dear to my heart, which is the small firm and the small case. As you just mentioned, the reviewability for 40, 50, 60 documents, for a small set that you want to quickly look at, for going through and saying, here's the relevant documents, here's documents for a specific feature. I think all of those are, it may be, and I'm not sure what Microsoft was thinking when they developed all this, but it may fall under the law of unintended consequences, that it was designed for larger organizations, but seems to me to be equally well suited for small organizations and small firms. Certainly the price point, it's just a question of buying the license at an extremely reasonable monthly charge per user. And I'm not even sure what that is now. It's in the neighborhood of $30, $35 a month per user, Rocky, for the license.
Yeah, that's somewhere around there is the list price.
Yeah. Which is certainly affordable for small firms, especially if they get one or two users who have the license and work. They don't necessarily have licenses for all the people in the organization. I think if there's anything, and maybe you can address this in your roadmap wrap up, that the one thing is, of course, that small firms, solos, tend to be a little technology shy, shall we say. They don't always feel confident in their ability to go in and use software, especially in a technical environment. They like to have menu-driven, easy-to-use choices, which is what some of the more popular softwares have given them. Powerful behind the scenes, but an easy-to-use software menu system that they can use up front. And I think that that's something that would drive more usage by solos and small firms in particular. I know I've mentioned to you in the work I do with the federal defenders. The defenders in large cities have what they call a panel, which is a list of attorneys who will take assignments in the federal system on a large case. And those tend to be solo or small firm criminal defense attorneys who don't have a lot of technology in-house or technology experience. So ease of use is going to be a big deal for them, as opposed to, well, as I said, not everyone is as technically adroit as say Craig Ball, who will find this all very easy to use, I think. But we're not necessarily dealing with that level of technical expertise. So I think that's something that for the small firms, user interface is going to be a big deal.
Yep.
Yeah. That kind of leads us into the roadmap. You wanted to talk about a few things, so why don't you finish up with that, Rocky?
Yeah, so I think we've been doing this, Tom, now for almost 6 months, this series, and like we said in the very beginning, Office 365, it's a very dynamic, ever evolving environment. The product teams are always working on adding more and more features in. So a couple things that to mention in terms of things that have just rolled out that are kind of in the newer stages. One is we talked a little bit about the the privilege identification and the classifiers. So getting to that, AI from a true machine learning perspective, but it's meant as a aid, right? So it's really meant to give a hint to areas where there might be privileged communications, and being able to tell the attorney, hey, don't forget to look over here because we detected something that there's a pretty good chance that that is going to be privileged. We're not saying it's privileged, but there's a good chance. So make sure you take a closer look at this. And I think that's one of the real ways that the machine learning and AI is really truly helpful is, again, making the attorney more efficient and giving them those different clues as to what should they be doing and where should they be putting that brain power towards actually, doing the good old-fashioned lawyering there. So that's one piece that's in the middle of rolling out. Another thing is the like I alluded to a little bit earlier, the Teams chat reconstruction, which is when I am searching for keywords, or I'm bringing in various different Teams chats. If I bring in an entire team and collect them or gather that data together and search it. So there's two pieces to this. One is the fact that when I do a search, and let's say I hit on a keyword that's somewhere in the middle of a conversation, instead of just bringing in that one line of the conversation, it'll go ahead and bring the entire rest of the conversation with it. And then the second piece is that in the review, it'll actually do the reconstruction to show it in a chat type format. So that way it becomes much easier for the attorneys to understand the ebb and the flow of the conversation and where that word or where that various different phrases or whatever it was that I'm looking for, where that was discussed and what the context of that discussion was. So those are two things that are in the middle of rolling out right now. And then just generally a couple of roadmap improvements that the product team has told me are on their way in the next few development cycles, are additional improvements around reporting, both from a case perspective as well as tenant-wide reports. So being able to, for example, say, show me all of the custodians that are on hold for my entire organization, not just within a single case. And obviously, all of that comes with the right permissions and the right security around it to make sure that only people who can actually see the holds are seeing them. So additional things around reporting, around delegated access. So the ability to be able to say, I'm going to take these 100 documents that I've now identified, or 2,000 documents, or whatever it is, put them into a review set and assign it to my outside counsel. So that way, when outside counsel comes in, they can't do searching against my entire environment. They can't, go ahead and do any additional pulling in data from the custodians. They can only see the documents that I've actually assigned to them, that they now can go ahead and do additional redactions or filtering or whatever they need to do, or tagging against that data. And then the last thing that I'm really excited for is some of the additional visualizations around some of the patterns of communications and some of the things around how they visualize email threading and some of the analytics. So
right.
That's some of the stuff that is on its way over the next few cycles. So really, I'm a customer here, so I'm excited to see some of these things and being able to put some of these things into use as they roll out. So I think Tom, it'll probably make sense that we'll do another little catch up or summary in some period of time, and we can discuss some of those newer things.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I was going to just tell people to keep their eyes open. Obviously, I'd blog about it, or we'll get the word out somehow that we would try to do some sort of a follow-up towards the end of this year or Q1 of 2020 to see where things are and bring everybody up to speed. And then in the meantime, Rachi and I are kicking around the idea of trying to do some sort of a regular monthly podcast around some of the more specific issues that have arisen in this discussion series. And we have to put our heads together to figure out how to do that. I mean, I hate that phrase. It makes it sound like a couple of Furbies. Put our heads together. We're going to have a discussion about how to do that, and hopefully we can get that rolling sometime by the fall. So with that, I think that literally concludes not just today's session, but this series in this iteration. I want to thank everybody for listening. I truly want to thank you, Rachi, for your participation. This has been a great series. Obviously, couldn't have done it without you and your insight into what's going on, not only with the product development, but the utilization of the product in a real life setting. So thanks so much for your participation.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Judge Rodriguez for encouraging us to do this.
That's right. A reminder that this was all started at the urging of Judge Xavier Rodriguez down in San Antonio, federal court in San Antonio, who wanted something to give to his students. He teaches a course on eDiscovery at St. Mary's College there in San Antonio, and I'm not sure he asked for a teaching aid. I think we've given him the Encyclopedia Britannica. So I hope, as someone said of a very renowned professor at my alma mater in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University, Rachi, a professor named Richard Maxey, who was a great student of the humanities and spoke something like 10 languages, and just you couldn't even begin to say what he taught, because he taught virtually anything, and we always used to quiver because if he wanted to come in and say something about remembrances of things past, he would start reading it in French, which was a bit of a problem for those of us who had, those of us who had trouble with English, never mind French. But the then president of the university, who was Dwight Eisenhower, brother Milton, was the president of the school at the time, and also a humanities scholar himself, once said, asking Professor Maxey a question is like going to get a glass of water and turning on a fire hydrant. You're probably going to get overwhelmed. So I hope that we haven't acted more like a fire hydrant to Judge Rodriguez here, and he gets some use out of this as well. But definitely a tip of the hat to him, and thanks to everyone who's listened to us. And Rachi, we will see you down the digital road, so to speak.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.